Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Stephen Gillon, the author of Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. He's written more than a dozen books and is a professor of history at the University of Oklahoma, and he was also the scholar in residence at the History Channel. We're glad Mr. Gillon is here, but we are sorry he's a Phillies fan. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Gillon.
I'm glad to be here, and yes, I am a diehard Phillies fan.
Well, sorry about the playoffs this year. I guess the Mets took care of them, but that's not relevant here. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Nearly 80 million dead, 70 countries involved, 2 nuclear bombs, and of course, a world reshaped in its aftermath. And also, Stephen Gillon says, 7 future presidents were changed irrevocably by what they'd experienced. They'd seen death, they'd lost friends, they'd feared for their own lives. World War II would shape their politics and policy. And Gillon argues that World War II wasn't just an event, it was the event. Is that the reason, Stephen, that even privileged men like JFK insisted on going into combat? Because they could sense that it would make or break the rest of their lives?
I think they were driven by a sense of duty more than anything else, a sense of patriotism. This is a generation that um, used their privilege to get closer to the battlefield, not to run away from it. JFK physically should never have been in the Navy, never mind being the captain of a PT boat. He suffered from numerous ailments, including a bad back. Couldn't pass a physical, so he used his connection to his father and then later his grandfather to first get into the Navy and then to get into the PT patrol. And George Bush is even more dramatic. I mean, he's from this incredibly privileged family who could have easily kept them out of the war. He was a senior at Andover, and he already had plans to go to Yale. But when Pearl Harbor happened, he just knew he had to defend his country, and he did it, and he almost died in the process. So all of these men, I mean, even Richard Nixon, who we don't normally think of being a courageous man, or we think highly of, but Nixon had a job at the Office of Price Administration, which was considered safe. It was considered part of the war effort, so he didn't have to enlist, but he did. He felt the need to defend his country, to be in the war. Now, with him, he did it out of a sense of patriotic duty. He also had political ambitions, and he and I think the others at some point made the calculation that they're going to be politically viable after the war, that they had to do something in the war. So Nixon lobbies, gets into the Navy, isn't happy with his position, wants to get closer to the front lines, and constantly is lobbying. And eventually he doesn't make it to the front lines, but not for a lack of effort. So I came away with a lot of respect for these men and for this generation in the way they felt the need to defend their country.
JFK said no school or parent could have shaped us the way World War II did. And I tried to give a sense of it at the beginning there, but this is a war that included not only several massive militaries covering massive swaths of the earth. The battlefield was huge, but if you include nuclear bombs, holocausts, the survival of the world was at stake, literally. Um, Somehow, and I'm not taking anything away, but somehow it makes Iraq or Ukraine from the 30,000-foot level seem, of course, not to the individual soldiers fighting. I mean, that's a different thing, but from the geopolitical sense here and the military, militaristic sense, those wars look like a playground skirmish compared to World War II. Try to just give modern listeners, the war was 80 years ago now. I mean, give listeners a sense of how big this was.
Well, this involved multiple nations. Um, I mean, there were um, hundreds of thousands of people who were killed in the war. And every aspect of American society was involved in the war. And this is one of the big differences between World War II and more modern wars, is that everybody participated. There were no exemptions, or there are few exemptions. Many of those who had exemptions still felt the need to participate. So we, since then, since World War II, we have been able to go on with our lives, even with the wars, certainly the modern wars. We go on with our lives. They don't really impact us in any significant way. It impacts those who are fighting and the families of
Right. If
those
you're
who are
not
fighting.
serving and you're not in one of the families, and I'll
Yeah,
admit
it's
it, for me, it was something to watch. It wasn't something I was
yeah,
involved in.
yeah. World War II is different. World War II affected every aspect of our lives, from rationing to participating in the war effort, working in factories for those who stayed at home. It was an event that was just all consuming. And there hasn't been, and the other thing, just one more point I want to make is I think that's one of the reasons why it's different from more modern wars is uh, everybody experienced it in one way or another. And in the modern wars, it's really since we did away with the draft, and we have a voluntary military, um, and in that sense, it sort of puts all the pressure on a small group of people and lets the rest of us go on with our lives. And that's why World War II brought us together, and created, even though each of these men had different experiences in the war, they were all there, all part of the war effort. And you don't have that in modern times.
I was thinking about World War One, and the impact that made on American politics. I mean, really, there's two presidents who served in World War One, and that is Truman and Eisenhower. But none of the presidents served after World War One was over in the military at all, until we get to World War Two. We know that World War One impacted European politics a great deal, but what about American politics? How did World War One cast a shadow over things until World War Two? Until World War Two.
Well, I think what it does is it creates, we went into the war with this sense of idealism that we're going to make the world safe for democracy. And it turned out to be very different. We didn't save the world, democracy. Uh, and there was a backlash against Wilson, against Wilson's idealism, a backlash against the war itself. There was a lot of uh, disillusionment. It fed this powerful isolationist movement in the 1920s, which is something that lingers into the 1930s, actually gets even stronger in the 1930s. And it's something that Roosevelt has to fight against to try to nudge America into the war, World War II. Right after World War I, we had the Red Scare, um, which was a part of this sense that we never should have been there. And there is no one who felt that way in World War II.
Right. Even to this day.
Yeah.
Um, our seven key figures here as they watch, and I love the fact that the book starts with with Pearl Harbor and their reactions to it. Ford clearly, watched and understood what had changed and that he would be changed. As these seven key figures watch Pearl Harbor happen, the news breaks. Other than Eisenhower, who was in the military already, and I think Johnson was already in Congress, it seems we know quite a bit about their reactions to this event. Just give us a brief synopsis of we know how a lot of ordinary Americans reacted, but how did these key future presidents react?
Well, they all recognized uh, after Pearl Harbor that the United States was going to be at war, and it was a necessary war, and one that they felt the need to be involved in and participate in. So I think JFK was playing touch football when he learned the news, and he immediately started plotting to try to get closer to combat. Gerald Ford was an isolationist, I mean, a committed isolationist um, who was in at home in Michigan when he heard the news over the radio, and even he's the one who changed the most because he was the most isolationist before, and he immediately felt that this was a necessary war. Nixon was working at the Office of Price Administration, was married to Pat, and and like everyone else, felt that for Nixon, I think there were multiple motivations. Part of it was really a sense of duty and patriotism, and the other was really a political calculation. He was already thinking about going into politics, and he knew that if he was going to be in politics, that he would have had to have some kind of war record. So he knows right away that he's going to try to push you closer to combat. Um, Reagan is the one who doesn't really have much of an impact on Reagan. He's told different stories about how he heard about Pearl Harbor, but it didn't interrupt his life at all. He didn't have that call to duty, like, my God, this is a life shattering event. I have to get involved in the conflict. He went off and made another movie. So he is the one who Pearl Harbor impacted the least. The most interesting one is Lyndon Johnson, who Johnson's already in Congress. He's a congressman from Texas in the Austin area, and and he immediately, he's been telling his constituents. He said, if we go to war, if I vote for war, I'll be in those ditches fighting with your sons. And then he's an ultimate political character. So he talks to Roosevelt. He wants to get closer to the battlefield so that he can tell people that he was in the
Yeah,
war.
the Caro passages on that episode are remarkable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with Johnson, uh, he goes on a flight. He wants to he's on he wants to get on it wants to say that he had been in combat, so he goes on a bombing run, and it just so happens his plane gets hit, and they never really see the battle. But Johnson, I think Johnson made a deal with MacArthur, which he said, listen, I'll be in Washington, I can be your advocate, and for doing absolutely nothing, Johnson gets a Silver Star. Like, if everyone going to get a Silver Star on that plane, it's the
Who was
pilot.
on the plane, right?
Yeah, I mean, the pilot's the one who saved the plane, but he gave it to Lyndon Johnson. And after the war, Lyndon Johnson, whenever he was campaigning, he'd like to have someone who had been disabled by the war come up on the stage and pin the Silver Star on him. Every place he went. And the fact is, there weren't enough Silver Stars, so he went to some store and bought it himself. So you would think he's a war hero. His combat lasted for about 5 seconds, was the amount of time that they were under fire.
Right. And what's also remarkable about that is that there were two planes that were going on that run. He was sitting, according to Robert Caro, he was sitting in one plane, and another person said, "No, that's my seat. You got to go to the other plane." And he went to the other plane, and the first plane got shot down. And
That's right.
if he'd been on that plane, American history would undoubtedly be a lot
Yeah,
different.
yeah. No, he actually he got off the plane to relieve himself, and then when he went back, someone was in his seat.
That's right.
So
Yeah,
he
that's
hopped on the other plane, and yeah, the plane he had originally been on was shot down.
incredible. Uh, so one of the things I think that's remarkable here is that, as you mentioned, the isolationism of that World War One created, but World War Two created the opposite effect. And I thought it was so interesting you point out that Eisenhower, JFK, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, none of them were isolationist, probably to a fault when you look back on things. What was it about World War II that made it clear to them that we had to have a role in the world?
Well, it was the lessons of Munich. And this generation wanted to do what they thought should have been done in the 1930s. So they believed that we had that American appeasement and Western appeasement of Hitler during the 1930s allowed him to launch World War II. So they were determined after the war to deal with the Soviet Union in particular, but also with other conflicts the way they thought they should have done in the 1930s. So one of the things that I do in the book is show how they all learned the lessons of Munich, this idea that if you let aggression continue, you only make greater sacrifices down the road, that you have to deal with it, up front. And they saw, they looked at Stalin and saw the face of Hitler. And the thing is that Hitler was a uniquely evil person. But a lot of these presidents misapplied the lessons of Munich, and it led to a lot of pain and suffering, including Vietnam.
Yeah. I love to ask authors, and just take a little sidebar here and just ask authors about how they put this all together and how they write their books and how they come up with the ideas for their books. Somehow there was still more to say about World War II. The key is just figuring out what it is that needs to be said, but you did. How did you realize that the impact on these presidents was not separate stories? For instance, a million books have been written about JFK and PT 109, George H.W. Bush and being shot down, but you realize that it's one cohesive story. When did you start to put that thread together?
Well, I've read and written extensively about post-war America, and I knew the biographies, the lives of all the presidents fairly well, and I recognized this was a common theme that runs through them. And I've always been interested in the presidency. I wrote a little book about World War II during the pandemic, and I wish I could take credit for the book, but it wasn't. I was looking for an idea. I actually had signed to write a book about Bill Clinton, but the Clinton Library was closed, and I needed to do something, needed another project, and so I was on the phone with my editor and my agent. Actually, it was a Zoom call, and we just explored ideas. And my editor said, "Listen, we know you love World War II. You love the presidency. You just wrote a little book about World War II. Is there a way we can combine them? Is there a way that we can talk about, the presidents who fought in the war?" And then as soon as she said that, it clicked. I realized that the book is going to be not just about these men in the war, but how it impacted their lives and how it shaped post-war America. So I give my editor the credit for coming up with this title.
There are quite literally tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of potential sources that could be used for World War II. Just as big as the war was, there are literally millions of sources in dozens and dozens of countries. How did you possibly narrow down what would be relevant to you and what you could, even if you were to read one of the presidents, all their sources on World War II, you would never stop reading. How did you manage this part of researching this book?
Curious about the forces shaping global trade? Current Accounts, the Henrik Foundation Trade Podcast, dives into trade policy, economics, and global trends, from the rise of protectionism to the challenges of non-tariff barriers. Brought to you by the Henrik Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to sustainable global trade. This podcast delivers valuable insights for policymakers, business leaders, and educators. Subscribe now on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Stay informed and shape the future of global trade.
Well, I knew that the places to be were the presidential libraries. So I did research in all the individual libraries, from JFK to Nixon and Ford. Whenever you do a book about post-war America and you're dealing with politics, you're always a wealth of sources. So my friends who write about colonial America or medieval times, their challenge is to find sources. And my challenge in writing about the post-war America is to do what you just said, is sort through and find the sources that you really need and ignore everything else. Because this book has a focus, and I wasn't writing a history of World War II, I wasn't doing biographies. I was just looking at this narrow thread of World War II and how it impacted. So that created some parameters for me. And then I explored the presidential libraries with the main source of information for this book. Some, like Kennedy, wrote a lot of letters. Nixon wrote a lot of letters home to Pat. So there was it was a topic that was manageable because it had a focus. I could deal just with this one thread and ignore everything else. And that's what you do whenever you write a book, certainly about post-war America. You have to have a topic. My grad students would come up with these ideas for a dissertation that would take 20 years to write because they have so many sources. So one of the first things you do when you write a book, come up with a topic for a dissertation, is you find something that has parameters so it's manageable. And I think focusing on just World War II made this book a manageable project.
How do you compare and contrast making history for TV, which you've done with History Channel extensively? What is it, how do you compare and contrast that experience with putting together a history for the written word for a book?
Well, first of all, I try to accomplish the same thing, but in different formats. And what I'm trying to do is get people interested in history. And when I do a book, I write history in such a way that I hope it's accessible to a broader audience. And when I do television, I'm not doing it now, but I would do television for 20 years. It was the same thing. It's like you talk about a topic in such a way that at least some of your viewers will go out and say, I want to go buy a book about this. I want to learn more about this. The big difference is that, I can write a 500-page book and on television, you get 60 seconds, 90 seconds to make your points. And that we were talking about this before we started the podcast. It's just, and it's a big challenge for historians to do sound bites because we have a lot of information and we like providing that information. So the big difference is in television, you need to discipline yourself. You need to identify precisely what you want to say, and that's all you get to say. Whereas in a book, you can expand on things. I mean, the book can go much further depth, develop characters, do all the things that you really can't do on television. But I think of television, I would do shows that would reach millions of people. And I'd love to have millions of people read my book, but that's not going to happen. But you reach an audience that you could never reach with a book. And for me, the big thing I learned before I started doing television, I was just an academic historian. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I was writing books like most scholars do to other scholars. And history taught me to reach a broader audience. It taught me how to a lot of the techniques we use in television, I use in the book. So every chapter begins with a vignette. The idea of telling a story that sort of grabs people and brings them in, and that's sort of the hook. So I learned from doing television. I hope I learned how to write a book that's accessible to a larger audience. And so since I started doing television, the types of books I write have changed, and I write more popular books. I try to write for a popular audience, and that was something I did not do before.
Why did you organize the book with this sort of TikTok fashion, this day by day thing? Doing this is the date this happened. Now let me
Yeah.
tell you about it. Why did you find that to be important and a way that, as you put it, would draw people in?
Well, it goes back to a comment you made earlier about uh, bringing about uh, making the book accessible. And I've always done this. I did a series of books called 24 Hours After, and I like the idea of bringing people into the story with a vignette. And because and war is, as you earlier pointed out, it was such a massive enterprise that which made it different from previous wars that we had fought. I mean, other than the Civil War, obviously. Um, and I needed to find focus. I needed to find a lens to get people into the story. So I would pick a day and tell a story to lay out what the themes of that chapter are going to be. And I think it's a way of bringing people in. It's a way of saying, okay, this is, here's a person in a place at a time, and I think it makes the book more accessible. It's something I've done in all my books is to use these vignettes at the beginning of chapters. It's in television we would call it the hook. It's something you do to grab people's attention, focus their attention, and then bring the story forward for the rest of the chapter.
God, I someday I'll tell you about how I teach interns about the hook. I call it the key, but
Hmm.
it's something that is so important to storytelling, and you really have
Yeah.
to find that thing to kind of open the door so that you can actually tell them what you want to tell them. It's
Yeah.
so important, and I work with interns on that all the time. All right, I want to get back to the plot a little bit here. So, one of the not one of the biggest thing to come out of World War II is, of course, the Holocaust, and 6 million people died, and 6 million Jews died, and you have probably 6 million other people who died and were murdered in systematic fashion. Um, how did the Holocaust itself, the fact that these death camps existed, how did that hit the seven presidents we are talking about here? What was the lesson that they took away from that, and did they fully absorb the enormity of what had happened?
It's a great question. I think the person who experienced it directly was Eisenhower.
Right. Yeah, it was at the
Eisenhower,
camp, and yeah, and we
yeah,
did an episode on that. Yeah.
yeah, Eisenhower. He saw and he never forgot those the images of these people who uh, were starving and near death. And he understood what the Holocaust was. He understood what the Nazis did. He understood what the death camps were in a very personal way. And that was something that he carried with him for the rest of his life. The other person who didn't see it personally, but Reagan saw some of the early newsreels about the Holocaust, and he was deeply touched by it. The thing about Reagan is he can feel an emotional connection without actually being there. Although he later thought that he actually had been at the camps, but he saw the on newsreels, and I think that he would cry when people would come over his house. He would show them. He took it with he took one of the newsreels with him home, and he would show it to people, and he would cry every time. Um, for the other presidents, it wasn't. I mean, the other presidents were fighting in the Pacific, and they were not. Um, they had no direct connection to the Holocaust, no personal. They didn't experience it personally the way Eisenhower certainly did. And the thing, I don't think the Holocaust. I don't think they had a full understanding of, and we as Americans, the nation didn't have a full understanding of it until it unfolded over time. And I didn't find any record of any of the other presidents other than Eisenhower and Reagan um, speaking directly about the impact of the Holocaust on them, which is something that's interesting. I should have thought about that. I should have put that in the book. That's a
Oh,
really,
well,
really interesting
you
question.
got plenty in the book here. Uh, uh, to just go president by president here, I want to
Yeah.
just run through them real quick. Eisenhower and his presidency, as you mentioned, he was there. He saw it. What ways can we find World War II foreshadowing and impacting what he would actually do sitting in the Oval Office?
So Eisenhower's an interesting character because I spend a lot of time talking about Vietnam in this book, and Eisenhower um, understood um, the downside of war. He understood the sacrifice and the death. So he always balanced that with his belief that we could never have another World War II. So in office, he rhetorically um, talks about the Cold War, really hard war in hard terms. I mean, um, uh, he talks about America's mission to prevent the spread of communism, but in his actions, he's very reserved. So when Dien Bien Phu is falling to the Vietnamese and the French are asking for American help, many members of his administration, including his vice president, Richard Nixon, wanted him to get involved and use nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower, despite his rhetoric, was very reserved. He said, we can't get involved in another war in Asia, in the Pacific. It's not our war to fight. And he says that at a cabinet meeting where he just overrides all of his advisors. And then he goes out and gives a talk to the public, press conference, and he reiterates the domino theory, which is that, which is what we learned from World War II, which is that one nation falls to communism, it'll continue to spread in more and more nations. So that domino theory suggests that we should be vigilant and aggressive in dealing with our adversaries. But rhetorically, while Eisenhower repeated that language, he, in his actions, was very reserved in the way he dealt with Vietnam, the way he dealt with the Soviets. He had a bellicose Secretary of State, but Eisenhower is very reserved. And I found that something of a pattern in all these presidents is that those who were closest to combat were the ones who were either the most reserved in the way they used the military force, or at least when they made decisions to use it, did so with a clear understanding of that they would be sending men off to death to die. That was certainly the case with Kennedy and with Bush, and certainly with Eisenhower as well.
JFK is this lazy-ish kid. He was sick. He was scrawny. You mentioned he shouldn't have even been in the military given his physical abilities. He had servants. He didn't have to worry about money. How did he perform so well when the chips were down and that boat had been sunk, losing men around him? There were several left to save, and he saved them. He literally used strength that I guess he had somewhere, but he barely had it. How did he perform so well at that moment, given the physical limits and this background of like, I can just kind of float through things?
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why World War II is a defining event for him, because it really changes him. It makes him a man, which he wasn't before. Kennedy is, of all the presidents, Kennedy is the one I find most fascinating. Whatever you think of
Me
him.
too. My daughter is named Kennedy, so.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He Kennedy comes from this place of enormous privilege, is a sickly kid, but he has this drive. Now, partly it's driven by competition with his brother, his older brother, Joe Kennedy, who joins the military and is considered a hero. And he and Jack had a competitive relationship, so that's a small part of it. But most of all is just his sense of duty, and his entire life. Kennedy was in enormous pain his entire life. It continued right up to his presidency, which is why he was on lots of medication. But there's no evidence that he ever once allowed his physical ailments to interfere with his ability to function. Robert Dallek wrote a wonderful book about JFK, and he was the first to get access to JFK's medical records. And it's shocking to think of the many ailments that he had. Any one of them would, if I had any one of them, I'd be bedridden.
And he had it at a young age too.
Yeah, it started, and and the treatment they were doing for, he had colitis, he had irritable bowel syndrome, he had and what happened is they were giving him medication. I think it was prednisone they were giving him, and they're giving him steroids. And over time, those steroids wore away at the bone structure in his back. So, when after the war, when he was running for office, he would always say that he had his bad back as the result of the incident PT 109 when they're run over by a Japanese destroyer, I think it was. But in fact, his back problems began at an early age, and they're a result of the treatments that he was given for his mainly for his stomach ailments. But he was in enormous pain all the time. But he rose to the occasion. And we hear these stories all the time of people who just find an enormous amount of strength in a moment. Where people who pick up cars, who because there's there's someone trapped underneath, and I think Kennedy did that in World War II. He certainly did it in the days after PT 109. But I wasn't fully aware until I did this research just how grueling that was and how extraordinary he was swimming.
He towed people with a rope in his mouth.
Yes. When the boat sank, there's one of the men on board who had horrible burns and couldn't swim. So Kennedy, I think, used a life vest. They put the strap here, and the life vest was on the man, and he swam, pulling this person. I forget how long it was.
It was like a quarter mile or something.
Yeah, it switches a lot. But then he never gives up. He goes on the beach, he collapses, he throws up, and he gets up and he goes back out again.
Amazing.
Trying to find. Yeah, it really is. And he clearly is the leader, and the things that he did while they were there really saved those men. I mean, it's an extraordinary story of courage that is undeniable.
How did Johnson apparently misapply the lessons of World War II and get the country mired in Vietnam?
Well, he thought that Vietnam was Europe, and that that we were fighting against another Hitler. Excuse me a second. So when South Vietnam is falling and it becomes with JFK, Vietnam was kind of a back burner issue. It wasn't really until the end of his presidency that he started to focus attention on Vietnam. So Johnson comes in, and it's clear that if America does not intervene, South Vietnam was going to fall. So for Johnson, he viewed everything that was taking place in Vietnam through the lens of World War II. And he believed that we could not allow a communist victory. He believed in the domino theory, that if South Vietnam falls, then the rest of Asia goes. And next thing you know, we're going to be fighting on the shores of California. So he was Vietnam. I mean, World War II became like a mental prison for many of these presidents, and Johnson most of all. So he believed that we had to to stop communist aggression the way we should have stopped Hitler early on. And that's why he commits American troops in 1965, why he continues to escalate the war. And the whole time he's anguished over this. Like, he realizes that we probably can't win the war. And a lot of the people around him come to realize we probably can't win the war. But he can't help himself. He can't be the president who lost the war, but he also doesn't keep up. There, a lot of the military people are advising him that that we can win the war, and we just have to send more troops and more troops and more troops. And by '68, Johnson realizes that McNamara, by this point, who was the main architect of the war, had come to realize we couldn't win, and he actually resigns as Secretary of Defense. So Johnson is torn between the lessons that he learned from the war, the belief that appeasement always leads to greater sacrifice, that Stalin is the new Hitler. So he's almost instinctively, it's like a tap below the knee, believes that he has to fight in Vietnam, and we have to win, we have to stop aggression. And it takes time before him to realize that we can't win. And it's really not until the end of his administration that he becomes serious about peace negotiations, about recognizing that we need to have some diplomatic solution to what's going to take place in Vietnam.
You said something in the book that just knocked my socks off. Nixon and his silent majority was actually impacted by his experience in World War II, the Southern strategy. Explain how you connected those dots.
So I think what happens, for Nixon, the lessons he took away two lessons from the war. First, he worked in the Office of Price Administration, and he resented. He had a deep sense of grievance and resentment that when he graduated from Duke Law School at the top of his class, that he could not get a job on Wall Street or in Washington. So he had to go back home and practice law there. And then when he goes to work in the Office of Price Administration, he sees how the bureaucracy works, how inefficient it is. He presents that a lot of his bosses are, prominent Democrats and Jews. And I think there is a sort of a streak of anti-Semitism that he probably always had, that is fed by this experience in the Office of Price Administration, that sense of grievance. So that's the one lesson that he brings with him after the war. And like the other presidents, he learned these lessons of Munich, and he wanted to apply them when he was in office. I think I may have missed what was the question again about the silent majority? Oh, yeah. So the thing is, while he was in the war, he set up this Nick's hamburger stand, where he was constantly borrowing things from other bases and providing things for the men around him, and he got exposed to a group of people that he had never met before. And this is something that's true of a lot of the presidents. They get exposed to, he got exposed to working class people, people from places like New York and Chicago, and people of different ethnicities, and he learned to communicate with them. That was what he learned from World War II, and then he carries the combination of this ability to talk to what he considers to be everyday people, to relate to them, is what comes out of the war. And you combine that with the sense of grievance that he brings with him from his work in the Office of Price Administration. And I think that is the foundation for what becomes his grievance-driven desire to reach the silent majority.
How did World War II make Reagan a Cold Warrior?
Well, Reagan experienced the war through film. He never left the United States. So the war impacted him least of all. But it he learned the same lessons, but he did so without the sacrifice, sense of sacrifice that many of these other men. So you take Eisenhower, for example, or Kennedy or Bush, who saw war up close. So they tried to balance. They had a sense of balance that that even though rhetorically they talked aggressively about fighting communism, they also had a sense that there was a lot of sacrifice involved, and he understood that sacrifice. Reagan did not. Reagan saw the war totally, completely through ideological terms, without that balance of understanding what really is involved in fighting a war. And of all the presidents, he's the one who emerges with the most rigid and most shallow um, view of world affairs. And it's simply black and white, good versus evil. And, it's just, and that's the way war is depicted in movies. And that's the way Reagan understood it. I have to say, though, one of the things that really surprised me about Reagan is that he's really the exception in so many ways because um, he doesn't experience war up front. He's very rigid in the rhetoric that he uses. But when he becomes president, he's actually reserved in the way he uses military force. And the one thing that Reagan emerges from the war with was the fear of nuclear weapons. And that made him open to Gorbachev's initiatives in the second term that allowed him to lessen tensions in the Cold War. Many of his advisors, his closest advisors, with the exception of the Secretary of State, were opposed to his willingness to negotiate and talk to Gorbachev. But I think it's Reagan's fear of nuclear war and the recognition that this was a moment where they could actually lessen the possibilities of a nuclear war led him to negotiate with Gorbachev and contribute to make a contribution. I think it's Gorbachev who really should get the credit for ending the Cold War, but Reagan was a partner in that. And again, that grows out of his fear of nuclear war from World War II. So he and when in office, he uses military force in Grenada, which was not exactly a major conflict, but in other ways, despite his rhetoric, he's careful about the way he uses military force.
Finally, George H.W. Bush and Iraq. How does World War II have an impact on his decision to get into Iraq, to reach the goals, and then get out quickly?
Yeah. So, that's I think Bush, and he says this in letters he's writing to his children about why he's going to commit forces to Iraq. And it's all about Munich. It's all about not repeating the lessons of the 1930s, that he sees Saddam Hussein as another Adolf Hitler. And he wants to do to Saddam Hussein what he thought the West should have done to Hitler in the 1930s. And that's why he commits American troops. But because he understood what war was like because of his own experience, he does it with a lot of thought. He does it with a recognition of the pain that he's going to cause families, but he really believes it's the right thing to do. And throughout the conflict, he is repeatedly referring to Munich and talking about Saddam Hussein as the next Hitler. But that puts him in a spot because he also, when we get to the point where we could have taken over, knocked Hussein out of power and taken over the country, he doesn't do it. He withdraws. And the challenge, the problem is that if Saddam Hussein is Hitler, you don't leave him in power. If he's that evil of a figure and that much of a danger, you can't leave him in power. And although it was the right thing to do, he tripped himself up by using World War II and Hitler as a reference and reasons for why he went into Iraq.
How concerned are you, if at all, that none of our recent presidents have served in combat? Clinton, Bush was enlisted or was in the Texas Air National Guard, but never was in a war. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, and now Trump again. They've never
Yeah.
served in combat. How important is that?
It's a great irony that in order to have presidents who understand what war is like, you have to have wars for people, and you don't want there to be wars to train future presidents. So, in that sense, I think I'm glad we haven't had wars like World War II. But the downside of that is you have leaders who know nothing about the military and really kind of learn on the spot and are heavily dependent on the military leaders for the decisions that they make. It was Bush's decision to go into Iraq. I mean, he was involved in every aspect of that war. Kennedy, when with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, it's and he was reserved in the way he used force because he understood what it was like. And we have presidents now who don't understand that, and that worries me, especially when you have presidents who not only don't understand war and the sacrifice involved in war, but have enormous egos. So I'm worried about the next 4 years.
What do you imagine a parallel book done on the impact of the war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan? How would that look? Has the global war on terror produced, do we know yet, whether it's producing political leaders in the way World War II is, and also as quickly as World War II is? I mean, Eisenhower and JFK take office, right after World War II is over.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I have an answer to it. I'm as an historian, and I try to put together things from 30, 40, 50 years ago. I'm really not good at
5 years ago.
Talking the present and certainly not the future. But I just don't think that we've had any experience that comes even close to the impact of World War II. The war on terror, yeah, I mean, we know about it. There's not much conflict. I mean, there's been conflicts, but nothing on the scale of World War II. It's possible that you can have. I mean, there are veterans of the Iraq War and Afghanistan War who are in Congress, but they're all over the place. I mean, they don't share the same.
Yeah.
They're not coming out with the same view of what America's role in the world should be, which may be a good thing because you'll have a variety of points of view and you won't be locked in like this generation was to one lesson, which they're trying to apply. But the thing about World War II that makes it unique and very different from World War I is that it was the entire country was involved in the war. Every single person was touched by it. And so many men went off to combat in that war and had experience with the horrors of war and carried those lessons with them. I don't think that the war on terror comes close to it. Not that the individuals who are fighting these wars aren't experiencing conflict and the challenges of conflict. There's just not as many of them. And whether this will shape the way they view the world, I just don't know.
One of the things you say is that World War II mattered to these 7 presidents much more than their party affiliations did. And I'm wondering, if a war started now, are the conditions ripe for this country to come together in the way that the country did during World War II?
And that's a great question.
Yeah.
We didn't have social media in World War II. We didn't have, as much misinformation. There was before Pearl Harbor, but after Pearl Harbor, the isolationist sentiment disappears. The nation rallies to war, and I just think that you would have these talking heads and offering misinformation to undermine public morale. I just don't think that one of the things that was fascinating to me is that it was useful and interesting to find a time when um, Americans were as united as we've ever been. And I just think that there's been so many changes since then in the media landscape and the rise of social media and just, this alternative universes that now exist that I don't think we're ever going to have that moment. And the only way that would happen would be if we had a war. I mean, a really World War III. And no one wants that.
Yeah. The book is dedicated to your mom, June Gillon. What impact did World War II have on her?
Well, that's a great question. She, my mom was born in 1931.
Is she?
So,
forgive me for asking. Is she still with us?
Yes, she is.
Oh,
Yes,
hi,
she
Mom.
is.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Hi, Mom.
Yes,
Yeah,
she
go
is.
ahead.
I just spent Christmas with her.
Oh, great.
We celebrated her 93rd birthday recently. Um, she, I, I said, I'm going to see her next weekend, and I want to ask her that question. So I don't know. She's never talked about it, and my dad too. They've talked about rationing. My mom has talked about how they had to ration things, and how much they loved Roosevelt. But I haven't had a conversation with her beyond that.
My grandma
Give me
was
my homework.
Yeah, there you go. My grandma would always say the war,
Yeah.
capital T, capital W,
Yeah.
the war,
Yeah.
And we actually found a diary entry from her that was dated, I think, the day that FDR died, and she said, President Truman? Who is this man? Something to that effect. It's a wonderful diary entry. I mentioned it on the show a couple times, but she really felt like FDR gave his life for the country.
Yeah, FDR was revered. And in part because back then, the White House could control the media.
Yeah, right.
The White House.
Don't show my wheelchair, right?
Yeah, I mean, and there was one message, and that message was coming largely through Roosevelt and his fireside chats. Today, we have multiple sources of information, and some reliable, most not. So I don't think we're going to have a figure as revered as Roosevelt. I think our society is too fragmented. We're too divided. And everything about the media contributes to that division. And it's completely different from the way people experience World War II.
Have you decided if you're going to do another book and what it might be about yet?
I'm surrounded by books now. I'm writing a book about the Clinton presidency. I wrote a book before called The Pact, which was about Clinton's relationship with Newt Gingrich, which gave me a sort of a foundation understanding of the administration. I want to go back and take another look at it. I'm one of these people who think Clinton is underrated as a president, and I want to go back and retell the story of his presidency.
I'll be interested to read that. There's been a dearth of Clinton books lately, and I've got, I don't know how many. I'm embarrassed to say I probably have 15 or 18 up there, and it's been a while since one has come out, so I'll be very curious to read that.
Yeah, I think he's ready for a reevaluation in the light of what has happened after his presidency. I think I personally see Clinton in a more positive light.
I could not believe when someone said, I can't take credit for it, someone said that he is the last president alive who served in the 1900s.
Served in the 1900s.
That's unbelievable. He's the last president alive right now to have served in the 20th century.
That's right. I'm thinking 1900s.
No. How long ago was that?
20th century.
Right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, because Carter just died.
Right. And so time just keeps going and going.
I know. Don't remind me.
Yeah. Stephen Gillon, the author of Presidents at War, How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's been a pleasure. I have to tell you, you asked the questions I don't usually get asked. And when I see my mom next weekend,
There we
I'm
go.
going to ask her about World War II.
There
Thanks,
we go.
Stephen.
The Evan question. There we go. Check out the book and also his website, which is stephenmgillon.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at smgillon, smgillon. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.